The sirens began as a distant shimmer in the cold air, thin enough that Lena almost mistook them for the wind sliding between the apartment blocks. She stood at her kitchen window, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea, watching the streetlights flicker with an impatience she had noticed all week. The news had been full of warnings, politicians trading accusations, analysts arguing timelines, but the world outside still looked unchanged. People hurried home with grocery bags, children chased each other across the courtyard, and the city carried on as if tension were nothing but a background hum. Still, Lena felt something tighten in her stomach, the same instinct she had learned to trust during her years as a field medic near conflict zones. Across town, Elias was closing his small repair shop, fingers stiff from hours of work, when his phone buzzed with an alert he had never seen before. The screen glowed with a government seal and a terse message advising citizens to remain indoors until further notice. He pocketed the phone, locked the shop, and started walking, each step echoing louder than it should have in the narrow alley. Lena finally tore her gaze from the window and set the mug down, ignoring the tremor in her fingers. She crossed the living room, the wooden floor creaking beneath her, and reached for the emergency radio she kept tucked behind a stack of medical manuals. She had bought it years ago, more out of habit than necessity, but tonight she felt a reluctant gratitude for her own paranoia. The radio hissed with static before a clipped voice emerged, announcing an unverified incident along the eastern border. No details, just a repeated instruction to stay calm and await further updates. The vagueness chilled her more than any confirmed threat could have. Elias quickened his pace, weaving through empty streets until he reached the main road. A few cars sped past, their drivers wearing the same expression of confused urgency he felt rising in his chest. He checked his phone again, hoping for clarification, but the alert remained the only message. He thought of calling Lena, remembering their last conversation days ago when she had insisted something was coming. He had laughed it off then, assuring her she worried too much. Now her unease suddenly seemed prophetic. By the time he reached her building, the sirens had grown louder, no longer a distant shimmer, but a trembling vibration that seemed to rattle the ground. He climbed the stairs two at a time, ignoring the neighbors who peered from cracked doors. When he reached her floor, Lena was already standing in the hallway, a backpack slung over one shoulder, her hair pulled back with clinical precision. She looked at him with an expression caught between relief and accusation. "So you heard it too," she said, her voice low but steady. "Hard not to," Elias replied. "What's happening?" "I don't know yet. But something's not right. The alerts, the broadcasts, the silence between the sirens. It feels coordinated." He nodded, trusting her instinct more than any official statement. They stepped into her apartment, the door closing with a decisive click. Lena moved with practiced efficiency, checking supplies, filling water bottles, marking potential exit routes on a worn map spread across her coffee table. Elias watched her, admiring the calm discipline in her movements, but he also saw the subtle strain around her eyes. The radio crackled again, this time with a fragmented report of a communications blackout in several regions. Lena froze, her breath hitching as she leaned closer to catch every distorted word. Elias felt a prickle crawl up his spine. A blackout meant isolation, meant something had already slipped beyond containment. He reached for the map, tracing the border with his finger, imagining the chaos that must be unfolding there. The room seemed to shrink as the weight of the unknown pressed inward. Outside, another siren wailed, longer and sharper than the others, and the sound vibrated through the walls like a warning pulse. Lena looked at Elias, and in that instant he saw the truth she hadn't spoken yet. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than either of them had dared to imagine. The lights flickered.
Once. Twice.
Then steadied. They exchanged a tense glance, and perhaps that was the first quiet warning of a night. Neither of them could shake the subtle pressure in the air, a sense that decisions made in the next moments would alter more than their routines. Lena stepped to the window, parting the curtains just enough to peer outside. What she saw made her inhale sharply. Military convoys were moving down the main avenue, headlights slicing through the darkness, soldiers perched atop armored vehicles with an alertness that betrayed urgency. Elias joined her, his expression hardening as he realized this was not a drill or a precaution. This was mobilization. "Do you think it's already started?" he whispered. "I think something's begun," she answered. "But whether it's the worst-case scenario or just a step toward it, we're about to find out." The radio beeped again, signaling an incoming emergency bulletin. Lena turned, reaching for the dial with a hand that remained steady only through force of will. Elias stood beside her, bracing himself as the room filled with the dry, authoritative voice of a broadcaster trying, and failing, to mask fear. "Citizens are urged to remain indoors," the voice said. "An incident has been confirmed along the border. Details will follow pending verification." The message cut off abruptly, replaced by a shrill tone that stabbed through the air. Lena's eyes widened. Elias felt his pulse stutter. Then, after a moment of unbearable silence, a new voice emerged, trembling despite its attempt at composure, delivering a single sentence that would reshape everything they thought they understood. "Officials confirm a strike has occurred. Further impact assessments are underway." The words hung in the room like falling ash, soft but heavy enough to crush the breath from their lungs in that moment. The words settled between them like a weight neither can fully carry. Lena steps back from the radio as if the distance might soften the meaning, but the room feels smaller with every breath she takes. Elias presses his palms against the edge of the table, knuckles whitening, searching for balance in a world suddenly tilting beneath him. A strike. No details. No confirmation of scale. Just a single phrase heavy enough to fracture the night. Outside, the sirens shift tone, deepening into a sound built for emergencies that no one has names for yet. Lena moves toward the window again, drawn by instinct rather than curiosity. The streetlights flicker with erratic uncertainty as if the electrical grid itself shares the city's panic. She watches the military convoy slow at the intersection, soldiers stepping out to block the road, their silhouettes sharp against the cold asphalt. A cluster of residents gathers at the edges, hesitant, restless, searching for answers that won't come. Elias joins her, close enough that she feels the warmth of his presence, though neither of them speaks. Their silence carries its own gravity, two people clinging to the thin thread between fear and clarity. Elias studies the street, noting the way people hover like shadows unsure of where to settle. He sees a man clutching a child, a woman pressing her phone to her ear despite the lack of service, a teenager standing utterly still, listening in the way someone listens for a second siren they pray won't come. Lena pulls the curtains closed, shutting out the fractured world beyond the glass. Her breath trembles, but her hands resume their disciplined purpose. She spreads the map again, tracing borders, cities, possible targets. Elias watches her closely, recognizing the familiar quiet calculation she used in tree-edge tents when time ran thinner than hope. She pauses over a cluster of marked locations, her jaw tightening. "If this strike is part of something coordinated," she murmurs, "we need to anticipate the next moves before the city changes again." "We don't even know what kind of strike it was," Elias replies, though the doubt in his voice makes his own argument fragile. "It could be an isolated incident." Lena shakes her head. Isolated events don't cut communication lines across multiple regions. He knows she's right. Every sign points toward escalation, a chain reaction neither of them can trace yet, but both can feel unfolding with methodical inevitability. The radio hisses again, but nothing coherent comes through. Interference builds like a storm inside the frequency. Lena twists the dial slowly, searching for another channel, but each one carries the same static, the same fractured echoes of a system struggling to hold together. A heavy, humming silence fills the apartment, the kind that wraps itself around the lungs and forces every breath to feel deliberate. Elias steps toward the small kitchen, filling 2 glasses of water he's not sure either of them wants. When he hands one to Lena, she accepts it with a faint nod, as if acknowledging something unspoken between them. Part gratitude, part fear, part shared endurance. The building shudders. A distant boom rolls through the city, muted but unmistakable. Lena's eyes snap to the ceiling. Elias braces himself instinctively. The sound is not sharp enough to be an explosion nearby, yet too deep to be anything ordinary. For a moment, they hold still, listening for a second echo. None comes. The absence feels almost worse than the noise. They exchange a tense glance. The air changes, colder now, as though the city exhales something it had been holding. Lena grabs her jacket. We need to check the rooftop. See what direction that came from. Elias hesitates before nodding. He follows her into the hallway, where the dim emergency lights cast elongated shadows across the walls. The building's stairwell feels like entering the ribcage of something ancient and unsettled. Each step creaks with a hollow pressure, as if aware of the tension rising inside its bones. When they emerge onto the rooftop, the night greets them with a quiet that feels unnatural. The wind brushes against their faces, carrying a metallic chill. Below, the city stretches into a darkened maze, patches of darkness spreading where power has begun to fail. To the east, Lena spots a faint glow rippling along the horizon, too distant to be fire, too steady to be lightning. Elias sees it too. That's not normal. No, Lena whispers. It's not. They stand side by side, watching the faint pulse intensify. It beats like a dying signal, too rhythmic to be an accident. Elias captures the pattern in his mind, counting the intervals. Lena narrows her eyes, analyzing the color, a cold, unnatural sheen that speaks of technology rather than nature. As they watch, a fleet of helicopters slices across the sky, moving in strict formation. Their blades carve the silence with measured precision. Lena feels her stomach tighten. Military aircraft flying at this hour, without commercial traffic, without warnings, signifies a shift she had hoped to avoid for one more night. Elias looks down at the streets. People begin rushing in waves now, reacting not to orders, but to instinct. Groups gather at intersections, searching for places of safety that may not exist. Cars flood the roads, headlights forming frantic rivers that twist through the dark. Some areas remain eerily still, as though the city has fractured into zones of panic and paralysis. We need to prepare to leave, Lena says quietly. If the grid collapses or the city shuts down, we won't have a window later. And go where? Elias asks. Anywhere less visible than this. He studies her profile, sharp, determined, shadowed by a fear she refuses to show. He trusts her judgment, even when the path ahead is obscured. He nods slowly. But before they turn back toward the stairwell, another sound rises through the air, low, unsettling, unlike the sirens that have defined the night. It carries a mechanical thrum beneath it, as if layered with something the human ear isn't meant to decode. Lena freezes. Elias lifts his head carefully, trying to identify the direction. The sound grows louder, vibrating through the metal railing at the edge of the roof. Lena steps forward, gripping the railing, peering into the darkness below. What she sees makes her breath stop. A convoy of armored vehicles is moving directly toward their district, far larger and more heavily armed than the patrols from earlier. It moves with purpose, with urgency, with a precision that suggests preparation for something more than control. Lena, Elias whispers, his voice strained. Why would they need that kind of force here? She doesn't answer immediately. She watches the convoy disappear under a bridge, the last vehicle leaving behind a plume of cold exhaust. Then she turns to him, her voice barely audible. Because whatever hit the border, it's not stopping there. The sirens return at 3:02 a.m., not with the frantic rise of the first hour, but with a low, dragging wail that seems to scrape across the city's exhausted nerves. The sound hangs in the cold air like a warning that has lost its patience. Windows tremble. Stray papers on empty sidewalks flutter weakly, as if trying to escape a night that refuses to end. Inside the dim shelter where the remaining families huddle, the light flickers with a pulse too irregular to trust. For a moment, the room is bright enough to reveal every face, every trembling hand, every shadowed glance toward the exit. Then darkness folds back over them, soft but suffocating, as though the building itself is holding its breath. Bob stands near the cracked window, watching the outline of the skyline dissolve into a smear of gray. Each siren's cycle presses deeper into him, not as fear but as a question he still cannot answer. He thinks of the first hour, of the disbelief, of the instinctual hope that this was temporary. But 3 hours stretch long enough to erode hope into something smaller, sharper. He watches Alice pacing slowly along the back wall, not out of panic but calculation, as if each measured step helps her map the city from within her mind. She murmurs details under her breath, time intervals, sound patterns, gaps in emergency broadcasts, and each fragment sharpens the quiet conviction she's been carrying since the moment she arrived. Tonight is not an accident. The radio crackles again at 3:09 a.m., a thin thread of static weaving itself through the room. A voice tries to form within it, but the syllables crumble before they fully exist. Bob moves toward it instinctively, adjusting the dial with careful, methodical turns. Alice stops pacing. Every face lifts. For a second, the static thins. A faint message emerges. Central grid, compromised, remain. Then the speaker collapses back into white noise. Bob leans away from the radio slowly, as though touching it any further would break something fragile inside the moment. Outside, the city hums with a strange, uneven life. The few remaining lights along the highway flicker like distant stars drowning in fog. High above them, a plane drifts in wide circles, unable to land, its blinking navigation lights cutting small wounds into the night. Alice watches its pattern through the glass. "They wouldn't stay airborne this long unless the systems below are failing," she whispers. Something's collapsing faster than they're admitting. Bob hears the tremor in her voice, not fear, but recognition. She has studied disaster patterns. She knows when a city crosses the line between damaged and altered. He steps closer. "If it were sabotage," he says quietly, "someone would have claimed responsibility by now." She nods, though the motion is hollow. Unless the chaos is the message. At 3:17 a.m., the power dips again, plunging the shelter into a darkness so complete that the silence deepens around it, thick as smoke. Then the backup lights buzz alive, only half the bulbs glowing, casting the room in a sickly yellow that feels more unnatural than the dark. A child in the corner begins to cry softly, the kind of cry that has no sound until the very end, a breath turned into a plea. Bob feels his chest tighten. The human voice is harder to ignore than the sirens. Alice kneels beside the child, whispering something too soft for anyone else to hear. The child's shoulders still. Bob watches her for a long moment. She is steady in the kind of way people become after losing something earlier in life. Someone who has already survived one version of the world collapsing and knows how to walk through the ruins of another. When the sirens cut off abruptly at 3:24 a.m., the silence falls so quickly it leaves an ache in the air. Everyone looks up. The absence feels wrong, like a heartbeat stopping mid-beat. Bob's breath catches. Alice stands slowly. "This isn't the end," she murmurs. "It's the transition." The city outside answers her before Bob can. The distant rumble begins deep within the earth, low enough to be mistaken for thunder, but steady enough to erase that hope. Glass rattles. Street lamps flicker in unfamiliar rhythms. Bob steps back from the window. The rumble spreads, rolling through the streets like a tide of something unseen but inevitable. Alice moves to the center of the room, arms rigid at her sides, listening with a focus that feels almost ceremonial. The lights fail again at 3:31 a.m., but this time they don't return. Darkness consumes the room fully, leaving only faint glimmers from phones held tightly by trembling hands. Notifications blink, messages fail to send, service flickers in and out like a dying heartbeat. Rumors cascade across the dim screens: grid collapse, chemical release, coordinated attack, radar malfunction, each swallowed by the next before it can settle into belief. Bob holds his phone low, the glow lighting only the bottom half of his face. He reads the final push alert before the network dies. National state of emergency declared. Stay sheltered. Await further instruction. The message freezes mid-refresh. His phone goes dark. He feels something cold settle in his stomach, the weight of a moment that cannot be undone. Alice's voice breaks the silence. We need to move to higher ground. The sentence lands heavily. People shift back instinctively. If the grid is down, she continues, and the rumble isn't stopping, then the lower districts will be at risk. Bob nods slowly. Her logic is brutal but undeniable. The city's infrastructure is old, fragile, built for predictable emergencies, not whatever tonight has become. Bob scans the faces around them. Fear layered over exhaustion, hope fraying like worn fabric. Choosing to move means choosing uncertainty. Staying means surrendering to a threat still unnamed. He steps forward, not because he's certain but because stillness feels like a form of collapse. We go together, he says. No one gets left behind. The group forms a line. Phones are raised to create a weak path of light. Alice takes the front. Bob takes the rear. The hallway outside the shelter is colder than the room they left, as if the air itself decided to retreat from this part of the city. Their footsteps echo softly, matching the slower, deeper rumble beneath them. At 3:43 a.m., they reach the exit leading to the upper streets. The door is heavy, its metal chilled, vibrating faintly from the tremor pulsing through the ground. Bob reaches for the handle. Alice lifts her phone to illuminate the threshold. The light catches dust drifting from the ceiling like falling ash. He opens the door. The night outside is unrecognizable. The entire skyline is dark. The streets are empty. And in the distance, where the sirens used to scream, a single tower emits a glow so faint it looks like a dying ember in the bones of the city. Alice inhales sharply. Bob blinks once. Something is moving near the tower, slow, deliberate, impossible to identify through the thick haze. And for the first time since the night began, the silence feels like a warning louder than the sirens ever were.